Thank you all for being here. We appreciate you. Thank you all who are watching us on YouTube. We also appreciate you. I guess I'll start my origin story. So you've heard my degrees are in history, but all of the history that I have studied has been Black history. So I don't know if you know this. My mother is from the Caribbean islands. She's Trinidadian. She will flag wave. She will tell you until she can't tell you anymore. She's a Trinidadian at heart, even though she's now lived in the United States forever. But in my house, Black history had kind of an ambiguous standing. My dad was very influenced by the Black Power movement and by living in New York City. So he was able to see Malcolm X standing on street corners. He lived through, really when my dad was born, Brown v. Board, for anyone who doesn't know, this ends school segregation. So my dad was born just in that moment. Though he didn't go through a segregated school system, not entirely segregated, because New York City school systems could not be entirely segregated.
And they're still segregated.
Yeah, they are definitely still segregated.
Only beat by New Jersey.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly.
But he was really more like the person who was like, oh, you need to kind of learn this, and collected books for me and took me on book tours through all the boroughs, or bookstore tours, all the independent Black stores. And then when I got to college, I think I kind of had an aha moment of like, this isn't just about knowing, it's about understanding. And so that for me was like the done deal. I knew I needed to understand, and I knew that I could be a participant in the communities, right? Like I could affect change if I understood a lot more about why people experience the things that they do in this country or globally. And I wouldn't have had that experience without his kind of prompting. So for me, it was about taking it a step further beyond, I guess, what the current generation would call being woke, right? Or like, beyond the aesthetic of, I understand, I know that this is happening, I'm aware that this is happening, taking it to, not only am I aware, I understand why it's happening, and I can think about ways in which I can help be a part of the solution.
I like that. You want me to follow that? So, similarly, both my parents are from the Caribbean. They're both Jamaican, and we're everywhere.
We are.
But and they came to this country in the 70s, and so they came sort of at the tail end of civil rights, and so there wasn't a whole understanding of civil rights movement for them, and sort of they know that they got to benefit from it as the fact that they got into this country, but not a true understanding of the whole picture. And so I get to college, I go to a predominantly white institution, I go to Yale, and I start as a math major, and we can talk about changing majors later, but and I said, I don't know enough about Black history. And it's the ways in which students always fall into the class that fits into your schedule. And so intro to AfAm fitted, and I got there, and it changed my whole world. We had to do things like watch all the series, TV series, and sort of what was going on in the civil rights movement. And I'm like, wait, I'm traumatized after I watch it, right? I'm like, I've watched people get hosed and be like, and I'm like, wait, how's everybody else fine and I'm not, right? And so really thinking about the ways in which my worldview changed. I mean, I knew growing up as a woman of color in New York, I was very clear that I was Black. Let me be very clear, but an understanding of the history and how we got to that place was fundamental to who I was then and who I am now. And I would never change 1 minute. And then I took every single Black course I could take. Economics, history, art. I became a sociologist because it allowed me to talk about race, and I was always interested in race and immigration in a very particular kind of way. Because I left math, I was like, I can't, I need some constructive things that let me do advocacy work, and that's where that took me. And those professors, I didn't realize until, you don't really appreciate your professors in college until later. They were some of the biggest names in African American history, and I just did not know, like Melvin Ely and Hazel Carby and Gerald James. And now I'm like, oh, I did not appreciate. I'm so sorry. I see them now, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. I should have studied harder. But really, life transforming lessons, classes, and just thinking about the kinds of conversations you have in college that you never get an opportunity to have again because you don't have that kind of time. And the ways in which African American studies is American studies, and people don't talk about it like that. And so I found myself also I was very self-righteous when I was young in my 20s, still am in some ways, and really getting people to understand that in order to understand the American experience, you have to understand the Black experience.
Right.
And I think for me, the added complexity at that time, because I'm a little older than you, friend, is having people understand the diaspora of Blackness. And that wasn't always easy, and I understand why. I mean, there wasn't enough space to even talk about African American history. Now you want to talk about Africa. Now you want to talk about the Caribbean. Now you want to talk about South America. I would get, Sherri-Ann, hold on for 2 seconds. And I get that. But in terms of the changing dynamics and changing demographics of the country, it was important to talk about the diaspora.
Right.
It was important to talk about the diaspora in terms of both not just race and immigration, but also religion. I was raised in a non-sort of traditional Black religious family, and so it was, so it's different when you talk about Black Catholics versus Muslims versus AME versus, it's a very different conversation. And African American studies lets you do all of that and have really rich conversations around it. So I'll stop there. But
and I think so. Okay, so I really love your story, right? And it reminds me of 2 experiences that I've had. So when I was in high school, and I went to a high school with mostly the largest demographic was Asian or Asian American students of Asian descent, and I was tracked on an AP course track, and I took this literature course. Well, they made me take the literature course, and I was the only Black student in the class. And my teacher, who was wonderful, this is not a knock to her, she decided we were going to do a series of Black writers, and she started with James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time.
Nice.
And she looked over
she did it. Okay.
And she said, Lacey, you're really going to enjoy this. And then she winked, and I was just like,
oh gosh.
Okay. And so I read it, and it was, I had never seen anyone use words in the way that Baldwin had used words. Like we read the Yellow Wallpaper, and we read all the things that you're supposed to read in an AP course at that time. But it confused me why she sort of directed her attention at me. And then, we had this discussion in the class when we had finished the book, and my classmate one of them said, Lacey, is this how Black people really feel? And then, of course, the whole class turned around, and I was like, I don't know. I don't even know how I feel about any of this. And she didn't mediate it. Again, not a knock to her, but she didn't mediate the conversation. And so it was, although, that gave me a moment to kind of fall in love with Baldwin and to help me see that there were lots of things I needed to understand in order to fully grasp the book. I kind of needed that balance, and I got that my first semester here. Professor Abdullah, shameless plug, who was one of my first professors. He was the first class I took on the first day that I got here.
Oh, wonderful.
And his presentation of Black history was so balanced that it not only did it help me to kind of go back to the book and reread it, but it also gave me a full sense of like where I fit in the diaspora and why it was important to think about diaspora. So I've sort of taken on this philosophy now of, I think we may all actually be Caribbean, all of us that are in the Americas. Like if you actually think about the slave trade, we may all be Caribbean. And then what does that mean, right, for us? And how should we be reconceptualizing what we say about Black identity, how we speak to one another, and all those things. But yeah, that balance is so important. But it was also challenging, right? Because it's hard to get those things that I learned. I wasn't always able to translate in my social circles, right? Because people are like, "But you're just Black, like why do I have to think through your nuance, right? Like it is easier for me to understand you in this way. It is easier for me to think about your experience as a uniform one. I don't want to be challenged to think through these things. But I think the courses also help, right? Because they give you some of those tools, right? And teach you how to use the tools and then find other ones. Story times.
No, very well said. And that challenge, that tension, I still see it. And I still get frustrated by it in certain spaces. And I'm like, we're really fighting about who's what. Blackness is our unifying. What's wrong with acknowledging the differences within the larger context of Blackness? and it is hard. And I like the way you said it, where, the nuances people don't want to deal with. But those are real. I mean, I would use phrases that were, for me, were natural growing up, and my other friends who were Black but weren't Caribbean were like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Did you say plats?
I said flat. I said things.
Dungarees?
I said things like, I got to spread my bed. And my friend's like, what is a spread your bed? I was like, and I couldn't figure out the appropriate
term for it, yeah.
Term for it. I was like, you pull the sheets up, and they said, you mean make your bed? And I'm like, you knew what I meant. But I mean, those kinds of things that seem small, but, and you're speaking English, but then cause different kinds of conversations. And I had challenges when I was in graduate school because people kept saying to me, why don't you just study Black people? And I said, I am.
Right.
They just happen to have immigrated here. And it was really, and we still do it, right? Sort of what Black culture is. I'm like, well, someone tell me what it is, and we can talk about it. Because to me, Black culture is just as much as Brazil, as it is Tanzania, as it is, Georgia, right? And so really thinking about how we use the tools that we learn in African American studies to have those really hard, and they are hard conversations.
Very hard.
Particularly when we're talking about limited resources. How do we talk about how they are allocated? How do we talk about who gets what? One of the biggest challenges, and I know you see this in school systems as well, the tensions that have arisen between African students, African American students, and Caribbean students, right? And who are the higher performing students, and who gets access to scholarships, and all of those things. And those are not easy conversations, but they have to be had. To be true about what the experience has been.
Oh, I'm not going to go on a soapbox about this. I promise you. I'm not going to get on a soapbox about this. But that's a huge part of the conversation, right? Is like understanding those nuances can also help us to think through how traditional African Americans are continually disadvantaged because of those nuances, right?
Absolutely.
Like, so you have everybody wants to be Black and African American when there is a scholarship to be had, when there's an opportunity to partake in, but they don't necessarily want to be identified as Black American in regular social settings. And what that means, you just said it, right, is that the students who have advantages they're not necessarily thinking about, they're multilingual, they come from a two-parent income home, they're et cetera, et cetera. Those are the students getting the opportunities and being identified as African American, but they're not really the targeted group, right? The group for which we create those categories to help close some of these equity gaps. Just crazy stuff.
I can't remember what year that article was. New York Times article came out, and affirmative action had gone left, particularly in the elite schools, right? So the biggest beneficiaries were biracial kids and children of immigrants. Oh, wow. They were like, you all were not the intended population. So what do we do now? And there were folks upset on both sides, but it was a real conversation. The time was Henry Louis Gates and Lonnie Guinier, God rest her soul. But I mean, just the ways in which but you have to have them. Yeah. And you have to be armed with the right language. Right. And the right approach to the work, because it is work.
It absolutely is, but it's not defined as work, right? So people think about a lot of times what we do as either just straight research, or it's activism, which people assume is always unpaid, or it's nonprofit work. It's not lucrative, so folks don't think about it as lucrative, and it can be. The skills that you develop in Black studies, AfAm studies, Africana studies are translatable in damn near every industry. It's just a matter of having the mentorship, the teachers, the instructors, the network to show you where you can apply your skills, right? But I mean, thinking about like doing that work and not having that work valued adds a kind of another dimension. So my family did not, they think that I collect facts. That is what they think I do. My mother likes the doctor title, so she will tell people that I'm a doctor, which is problematic, because then people will show me rashes and things I don't want to see. Like, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm not that kind of doctor. But like, I just think about that disconnect, right? Like, you collect facts, and the facts are about Black people, right? But it's just like, there are very many other things that I do which don't have to do with facts, right? So like, sharing that with students, like how can you market yourself and market the skills that you're developing in a way that's going to be lucrative for you, but also be satisfying, right? So that you don't get caught in is sort of what I experienced. You know, a doctor, a lawyer is something that's good for you to be. Maybe you can be a teacher, right? But one of those tracks, or do something in engineering. And so it's like, how do you use Black studies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where do you apply that? What skills do you develop from that? Did you experience that, or was it?
I absolutely did, because at first my parents were like, "You're doing what?" And and then also moved. I did it both at the same time. I moved from math and did sociology with concentration in AfAm. I was one class short of double major, and I was really mad, but I wasn't trying to stay another semester for one class. And so, the ways in which, so where are you going to go with this? And I said, I am a much more intelligent person as a result of this. That doesn't go far when people want you to get a real job, but the ways in which I used to make the argument about, don't you want me to follow my passion? Right. And that my parents got. Not every parent will get that.
Mine did not.
And I promised them I would have a job, because I told them I did not like poverty. But so I said, don't worry, I'll be employed. But I do know in terms of the marketing skills, and I've seen it. I have a much better understanding of it now that I've been out for so long. Mm-hmm. Of that, it absolutely helped me. It still helps me in every single thing I do, even at Rutgers-Newark, right? In terms of the ways in which I'm able to have not just intelligent conversations, but I can debate folks. I can think critically about things. My social skills in terms of, Professor King can tell me I'm wrong, but the ways in which the social skills, your level of social interaction and understanding and empathy is very different after you come out of this with this major, right? And even when I fundamentally disagree with someone, I can still have a conversation with them in a way in which we hear each other. Right. And part of it is because I've had to, right? Yeah. Part of it is because of African American studies, Africana studies, Black studies, we've had to really fight and scrape for every piece. Right. That you've been trained in lots of ways to be understanding, to be sympathetic, to be empathetic. And those are absolutely transferable skills. And so the ways in which people enter into the job market, you can be a little hard sometimes, right? But you've situated yourself in such a way that you are the person that they find. You can be really grounded in what you believe in, and what you advocate for. But there's a way in which you do it that is received in a particular kind of way. And so that's, for me, that's important.
I was thinking about something similar the other day, because someone that I love was in a DE&I talk for corporate America.
My favorite.
And I was at the same time reading this book called Read Until You Understand. And so it's about reading and literacy practices in African American communities. And there's a part of the book where the scholar essentially says that reading, literacy, understanding is a practice of mercy and also a practice of love and self-love, right? And so in this conversation, I was thinking, how merciful is it, right, for you to sort of sit here and have to, because their complaint was, the conversation is really supposed to be about racial aggressions, and instead it's about how relieved some of the people in the group feel about now they know, right? I'm so grateful that I know now that I'm not going to offend you anymore. And it's sort of like, this is not a therapy session for you, right? This is so that you can kind of understand the dynamics of this company and ways in which you might be inhibiting me from progressing, from feeling safe, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a merciful act, and there's something pretty fantastic about, for me at least, using that as a metaphor for all the work that we do, right? Absolutely. It's sort of like being agents of mercy in our society, right?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, being agents of mercy while also helping people own what's going on, right? I'm not letting you off the hook because I know how to have a conversation with you and tell you that you're not off the hook, right? But in a way in which most people, not all people, most people can receive it, right? And so, and that's a delicate balance.
It sure is.
And particularly now, and when you said DEI, I'm like, oh yes, because now everybody wants to be DEI.
Everybody.
And I'm like, but do you mean it, or are you just saying it because it's something that we're supposed to do? Right. And if you mean it, these are the things that, as a result of my knowledge of African American studies, history, culture, I know how to tell you what that actually looks like, right, or how that actually plays itself out. And so, I don't have time. I tell people all the time, I don't have time for the tears. Right?
They're always tears, aren't they?
I mean, but they've been tears on the other side for a really long time. I don't have tears on that side. Yeah. Right? It's hard here, and my job shouldn't be then turn around and make you feel better because you I don't have the space for that. what I do have the space for is a conversation with you about how we got here. I'm not trying to guilt you into anything, but we need an honest conversation about distribution of resources, about systemic racism, about inequality. And if you want to cry, here's some tissue, but we still have the work to do.
Right.
And that's not always easy for lots of people.
Right.
And it's still a struggle because people will say, I want to do DEI work. And then when you say, but actually, your hiring processes are problematic.
Right.
The way in which you don't retain whether it's higher ed or corporate America, how you don't retain your people because of the kind of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Then they're like, wait, you want me to change my entire business practice? Yes. Actually, yes. And higher ed is not exempt from that, right? I mean, I tell my students all the time that, higher ed was not built for folks of color. It never was. And so what do we need to make it look like in order for folks to be successful? Yeah. And that's hundreds of years of undoing, but that doesn't mean we don't do it.
Right. And I think it's like it's a means of helping people feel accountable for future rather than trying to force them to feel shamed about things that have been happening for longer than most of us have been alive, or things that have been happening for longer than our living memory in some instances, right? So one of the things I think I've taken from the discipline is, how do I speak to people in a way that encourages them or nudges them towards accountability for future? No, you didn't create this. No, it's not your fault. No, you didn't ask to be born. But like you said, the work still has to be done, right? And someone has to do it, and it's got to be all of us. Like, we all live in this society. We're all responsible for it. Otherwise, you can't continue to say, well, I didn't know, right? You do know now. Social media makes it impossible for you not to know. You're going to know, right? But once you know, then what do you do, right? And
what's your responsibility now?
Exactly, right? And taking on that responsibility is a big task, right? It's work, but work that's essential for, I think, not just a just society, I would say, but like, I think I'm always aiming for, in my mind, that like beloved community.
Oh, you're so good.
I'm not. I don't think that I am. But I still want that, right? Like I still want to. I don't want to have to shed my difference in order to exist equitably in a space, and I don't want other people to have to shed their differences in order to coexist with me. And that means I don't get to say to people, it's not my responsibility to teach you. If I don't offer you my lens, you won't have it, right? And if I don't offer you my lens, also you're not going to offer me yours. We get kind of stuck in the like cultural silences of, I'm just not going to talk about this because someone will be offended, sort of a thing.
Yeah, no. Like, I mean, our differences, we have differences. Our differences doesn't mean that we can't be friends. It doesn't mean that we can't be colleagues. It doesn't mean that we can't just coexist in the world. And I've always said to folks, I'm like, I don't, when they're like, oh, colorblindness, I have never believed in that thing. I'm like, I need you to see me. And I know you do, because if I stole your purse right now, you know exactly how you describe me to the cops, right? I mean, so we're not colorblind, but it's the differences that it's what you put on the difference that makes the issue, right? And so the ways in which your perceptions become my lived reality, and that's the problem. It's my lived reality. And so we have to talk about what that means. And again, I know we keep coming back here, but really in the ways in which Black Studies give you the tools to have those conversations, because you know now, to your point, you can't unknow.
Right.
I know that New Jersey is the 6th most segregated school district in the country. That's crazy.
It is.
They were like, oh, New Jersey is a northern state. Well, we were also the last ones.
Right.
And so just the ways in which, and we have to confront New Jersey on that, right? Yep. As a native New Yorker, I'm like, all right, New Jersey, but New York's not much better either. And so the ways in which we really do have to question the society in which we find ourselves. And if we don't, once you know and you still don't, I got a little issue with you on that one.
Sure.
Because if the people hadn't done the work, our ancestors hadn't done the work, we wouldn't be sitting here.
Right.
So we have no excuse not to do the work ourselves.
Sure. And then you have the ability to flag the repetition of history, right?
Absolutely.
Or people's repetitions of historical things, which I think is the most important right now as we watch so many things be repealed and pulled back. And we have the language, we have seen it before, but are we able to identify it for what it is and then to call foul and then figure out a means of going forward?
Right. And for me, I think right now the challenge, and I admit this in front of you all, is a challenge. How are we defining what advocacy looks like? That's also a hard conversation, because is it that I send out a tweet and I've done my job?
Right.
I've posted something on Instagram, I've done my job.
Right.
Or do I need to really be in the street rallying? Do I need to be writing to my politicians? Do I need to be talking to school districts? I mean, it's a lot. And it's not an easy question or answer.
No. I mean, what do you say to your students about that? Because I'm inclined to be prudish in that way. And so I will say to them, like, it is a type of activism, but it may not necessarily affect the kind of change that you're hoping to see, right? Like you're raising an awareness, but then what, right? Or you're calling attention to a problem, but then what? Have you thought about what it would look like to address this? Usually the answer is no, right? Or the other thing, and I was talking to my class about this today, what it means to kind of replicate trauma through the use of social media, calling it activism, right? So we're going to continue to say their names, but the family's not done grieving, right? Or we're going to keep sharing videos of people being abused and detained and murdered, and the family and the community has not grieved yet. And so it's sort of like, this is problematic too. That's generally my answer, which is it's not satisfying to to many, I'm sure. But how do you respond to that?
Oh, I have a similar response as you do. And in that way, I own my traditionalism, right? In terms of, I appreciate and I really support the tweet, the Instagram, the IG post, but I need you to be a little bit more active than that. Because some of the people who we need to impact aren't on Twitter and they're not on Instagram. And really in the ways in which I appreciate that, but I need to take it one step further.
Sure.
And so I fall in lines of, and I like a good debate. So my students will, really? What are you trying to say? I didn't do anything. And I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that we can always do more than we are. And I know that we're all busy, but so were the students of the 60s. Yep. So were the students sitting at lunch counter. So were the students getting hosed. And so what makes our world so amazingly harder and different than theirs? Because it's not a struggle to go to the party. Well, it is now, but before it wasn't
not
a struggle.
for all of them.
Right, it wasn't a struggle
not
to go
a
to the
problem
party. For some of us, exactly. One of the things that actually set me off, and I will freely admit this, during COVID, was that somebody was like, "You all need to lift this mask thing because this is like slavery." I'm like, "Oh, you've lost your mind. A mask? You're still breathing, right?" I mean, there's the ways in which we need to think about the importance of language and what trauma looks like, and how that feels like. And so, I worry about sometimes the sort of ahistoricizing that lots of us do. I don't mean just college students. I mean lots of people do. And how do we get people back to what we know I was going to say what we know to be true, but some truth now seems to be debatable. But how do we do that in a way that moves us forward and not has the back where we're worried about voting rights and redlining and all the things that we've constantly been worried about?
Yeah. So I'll say, I feel like sustainability, not in the traditional sense, but that's so much more important to the discipline, not just in the ways that we have to sustain ourselves within a space that we're really universities were not made for us to be here, right? But certainly not our formal presence here as a department, but also like thinking about how communities can sustain themselves, how we as departments can help sustain communities, and what tools we can give to our students. I don't want to say should, but what kind of tools can we give them to help them think about how do we help those communities that we say need justice thrive, right? Like and I think that to your point about social media, that's where it really counts, right? Because I can talk about a water crisis, but am I helping to purchase any water? Am I going to make sure, oversee sites where water might be, passed out? Am I talking to people in the community? Like, am I taking any steps beyond that? And do I feel that I have the ability to do those sorts of things? And then have I conceptualized any other ways in which I can help sustain a community? I feel like that's where we maybe can go as departments in the country.
Yeah, you're good. You're saying can. I'm on the should side. I mean, I think education writ large has a responsibility to move us forward, and so it's the should and not the. I mean, it can, but it should. I'm sorry. I'm one of those people who thinks it should. I mean, I've seen amazing, and I won't call it acts of kindness, but it is an act of kindness, but massive activism as a result of COVID, right?
Right.
And a lot of it was people who took the things that they had learned in their various spheres, some of it college, some of it not, and did amazing things. I was just talking to a student randomly last week, ran into on the hallway, it was spring break, and talked about, the amount of a clothing drive that they just decided to run during COVID. And they said, I was wanting to talk to one of my professors, and we were talking about in class, perfect example, we were talking about housing insecure people, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And I went home and I looked in my closet and I saw all these clothes I do not wear. And so then I rallied my family, I rallied my church, and we did this. And she said clearly it was because I was in class and we were talking about housing insecure people. That's the kind. It doesn't. I'm not. We're not asking folks to. Well, in some ways, if you could change some laws, I'd appreciate it. But I mean, other than they're the ways in which we talk about sustainability.
Right.
They are literally right now. She's an older student. She and her husband and her church and her family and her community are feeding communities around New Jersey.
That's beautiful.
And clothing them. And she said, honestly, I passed them every day, didn't think about it until my professor talked to me about housing insecure folks.
I'm actually surprised at how many students don't know what a critical need is until they take a Black Studies course. And then they're like, oh, I had not thought about that before. And I guess the assumption that I've always made is if you see it, you know it's there. So you always know it's there. And that isn't, that as I am continually learning, that is not the case. I often have students who will say, well, what is a critical need, right? So if I'm going to do, one of the projects is a service learning project that they can opt to do. So students will say, but so what's a critical need, right? Where can I provide service? And they don't think about housing insecurities. They don't think about food insecurities. They don't think about the need for tutoring services or childcare or all of the things, right? And in these classes, those are the kind of point of access for a lot of the discussions, right? That there are these larger mechanisms, but here are the day-to-day things that they create that we can resolve right where we are by looking in a closet, right? Or by asking someone, how many baby clothes do you still have in the attic that you're not using? Somebody else can use those. They would be really grateful for them because they can't purchase them, or diapers, or all those things. So this gives me much to think. Now I feel like I'm going to need to change this project.
But that's the beauty. We can do that as we've learned things, and even I think the subjects and the areas that people don't often consider, right? So climate change. So some people are super active about it, and some people are like, yeah, it's fine. I'll probably be dead before something happens. Except that when you look at issue as a Black studies, Africana studies, and looking about climate justice and which neighborhoods tend to be disproportionately impacted, it becomes a different kind of issue, a different kind of conversation, right? And so when we talk about critical need, water, so when we had water crises, whether it be Newark, whether it be Detroit, there were real things that got done, and luckily we had a mayor here, but I mean, there are cities everywhere who are suffering from this, and there are solid consequences to that. That are we having those kinds of conversations, right? The Ironbound is still talking about things that they're still living through as a result of climate issues. And so climate justice is also a racial issue. It is also a Black issue. And unless you're armed with the right knowledge and language to have that conversation, that sort of takes you in a different space. So, I mean, it's just interesting sort of what else comes up for folks that are not obvious.
That maybe should be.
That should be, exactly. Oh, you don't like should. I'll tell you, but that should be.
Okay, I know we're out of time. Out of time completely?
We have a couple of minutes because I know this is the free period. That's
oh, yes.
So our students will have other classes. But are there questions? Because I don't know if this. Okay. So I can just listen to you all talk.
I guess in your roles in the university and outside the university, how has this field of study helped you kind of address contemporary issues in urban systems, particularly Black people?
I like that. You want to go first and I'll edit?
Sure, and I'll stay off the soapbox. So I mean, I think as a student, all of the things that I learned specifically about urban spaces were directly connected to what I saw as a child, right? And as a teacher, I think it helps me to better understand where my students are coming from when they are, connected to Newark, connected to Jersey City, to Camden, to East Orange, to all the spaces, right? It gives me a sense of how to approach instruction with them. But also, I think what is really helpful is because of my own experiences and because of my Black Studies experiences, I should say, I'm able to give my students room to figure out what their position is in resolving the issues that they see, because that's critical, right? Like it was one thing for me to know, as a kid in the Bronx, like there's a lot of vacant lots out here, right? Filled with mattresses and barrels of stuff that's leaking, that shouldn't be leaking, right? And all kinds of stuff. But it's another thing for me to know that, to recognize it, and to then know, oh, like this shouldn't be like this, and I can do things about it. Like there's a direct person that I can call or email, or I can show up at their office and say, hey, right, like why is this is a hazard to me. I can rally other people around those things. So I think for me it is 100% experiential. And then having the tools that come from Black Studies have given me the ability to resolve some things for myself in the work that I do outside of universities, but to give my students the ability to recognize and think about resolution.
I don't know if you say anything else. No, similar. I think it also made me a better instructor, right? I mean, as a professor, I remember what I also didn't like in the college classes. I'm like, oh, my professor could have done better than this. Or, I didn't learn as well as I could have because of X, Y, or Z. And so, not exclusively, but in my Black Studies classes in particular, there was an attention to how students learn. We all know that students learn differently, but that's not exactly how we're taught to teach.
Right.
So there's that. So there's better instruction. But then in my role that I currently have, part of knowing from Black Studies perspective, and particularly thinking about systemic racism, issues of equity and access, my job is to figure out how to get more access to students who would not ordinarily have it. And because I understand how systems work, I'm like, okay, we can't do this because then this will happen. So how do we create a scholarship program, for example, that allows a student to come in and not pay a ton of money to be, or to leave with a bunch of debt? Those are hard questions because I still have to operate within a state. I still have to operate within a federal government, but I do it as much as I can because I'm very aware of what you all are up against. And so I end up having fights all the time because I'm like, look, my students can't afford X, so what are we gonna do to make that happen? Or my students are hungry, what are we gonna do for that? And so having that knowledge base has been phenomenally important, which is why we're always advocating for people to move forward, because unless you're at the table, you can't make the changes that need to happen. And so I'm not saying that I'm moving by myself, because I have Chancellor Cantor, I have a whole team, and my team is incredibly diverse and amazing. But we also challenge each other about, this is what I know is happening, this is what I know has happened, this is what could happen. How do we enter into this space to make a better, and this is gonna sound a little dramatic, but truthfully, a better world for our students? Because we do count on you all to take us to the next step. And, I know Shaki's heard me say this 50 million times. Rutgers students are my babies, whether you're 16 or 65. If you didn't get the degree you came here for, you're my baby. And my responsibility as you all being my babies is to provide you the access and the opportunity that many other people would never have. And not to put a whole bunch of responsibility on you, but I'm gonna do it, is because there is an expectation that you are also gonna improve the society we currently live. And Black Studies did that for me.
So please join me in thanking both of the ladies.